Okay, so just when you think you're getting a handle on Bitcoin, the landscape shifts again, right?
Always something new.
And today, it's a really interesting collision, you know? The a very traditional world of public stock markets is meeting crypto head on.
You're talking about the American Bitcoin news.
Exactly. Eric Trump's co-founded Bitcoin mining firm, American Bitcoin, well, it's gearing up to go public. This could genuinely change how a lot of people access Bitcoin investment.
Yeah, and it's fascinating timing, isn't it? Because our sources show this happening right alongside all this recent Bitcoin price movement.
The dips and climbs.
Right, which seem really tied to um, global economic news,
Yeah.
specifically the U.S.-China trade stuff.
Okay, so that sets up our mission for this deep dive then. We need to really get under the hood of this American Bitcoin public offering.
Understand the significance.
Yeah, what does it mean for investors, for accessibility, and how does it all slot into this bigger picture, the market ups and downs driven by these global economic tides?
Essentially, what does it mean for Bitcoin as an asset class right now?
Precisely. So let's start with the nuts and bolts of American Bitcoin going public. Who are the main players we need to know?
Okay, so you've got Eric Trump, obviously. He's a co-founder and the chief strategy officer.
Right.
Then there's Gryphon Digital Mining. Their ticker is GRYP. And Hut 8, ticker HUT.
HUD 8. They're involved too.
Yep, and importantly, Asher Janut, who is the CEO of Hut 8, he's also going to be on the board of the new American Bitcoin.
Okay, so it's kind of a group effort. How does this actually work? How do they go public? Sounds complex.
Well, it's basically a merger. American Bitcoin is merging with Gryphon Digital Mining.
Oh.
And the mechanism is a stock-for-stock transaction.
Hmm.
So Gryphon is essentially like acquiring American Bitcoin but paying with its own stock.
Gotcha. So what's the final picture? What will people actually see listed?
The company that comes out of this will be called American Bitcoin,
Yeah.
and it's planned to trade on the Nasdaq.
Nasdaq. Okay.
Yeah, under the ticker ABTC. And that's pretty significant, putting a dedicated Bitcoin mining operation right onto a major public exchange. It offers a different way to invest in the Bitcoin infrastructure, I guess.
Right. Not just buying Bitcoin itself. And this is where it gets really interesting for me. The market reaction.
Oh, yeah.
Gryphon's stock, GRYP, it skyrocketed up 285% just on the news.
Incredible jump.
But then Hut 8, who, helped create American Bitcoin, their stock went up only about 10%. And they're still down, 25% year to date?
Mm.
What's going on there? Why such a huge difference?
Well, that difference, it could suggest a few things, right? Maybe the market is just really excited about this fresh, focused Bitcoin mining play appearing on the Nasdaq via Gryphon.
Like a new opportunity.
Exactly. Gryphon itself, maybe it was seen as needing something like this, a catalyst. So the merger news gave it a massive lift. Hut 8's reaction being smaller.
Yeah.
Maybe investors already kind of expected their involvement, or perhaps there's other sentiment around Hut 8 specifically.
So maybe the market sees the biggest immediate upside connected to the Gryphon part of the deal.
Possibly. It raises questions about where investors perceive the most concentrated value unlock is happening.
It definitely does. And then you layer in Eric Trump's statement. He said they want to create the most investable Bitcoin accumulation platform.
Right.
And he calls Bitcoin one of the most important asset classes of our time.
Well, it's a strong statement, especially from someone with that kind of public profile. Why is that particularly noteworthy?
Well, his involvement, given the family name and connections, it could, for some people, signal Bitcoin moving further into the mainstream financial world.
Lower the perceived risk, maybe.
Potentially, yeah. For investors who are more comfortable with figures from traditional finance or politics, it definitely brings a certain level of attention. It's a high-profile endorsement that could shift perceptions. Absolutely. And then Asher Janut from Hut 8, he adds that going public is a critical step towards scaling the business. Let's talk about scale in Bitcoin mining. What does that actually mean in practice? Why is it critical?
Scale is hugely important in mining. I mean, fundamentally, it lets you deploy more computing power, more miners.
Which increases your chances of finding Bitcoin.
Exactly, finding the block and getting the reward. But it's also about efficiency. Bigger operations can often negotiate better energy prices, manage their infrastructure more effectively.
Lowering costs.
Right, which boosts profitability. Plus, a larger miner has a bigger slice of the network's total hash rate, its processing power. It's about efficiency and probability.
Okay, that makes sense. So that covers the American Bitcoin side pretty well. Now let's pivot a bit. Let's look at Bitcoin's price itself. Our other source talks about a drop down below $102,000.
Yeah, and that came after quite a bit of volatility, didn't it?
It seems so. What was the context there?
Well, the source mentions Bitcoin had actually surged quite a bit before that drop, getting close to $106,000.
Wow, okay.
And that surge seemed linked to this temporary truce announced in the U.S.-China trade war. It built on some earlier gains, too, apparently after some UK agreement following what they called the Liberation Day tariff shocker.
So it looks like good news on the trade front tends to boost Bitcoin. Less global tension, Bitcoin goes up.
That seems to be the pattern recently. But the source also brings up that old market saying,
Buy the rumor, sell the news.
exactly. It looks like that's what happened here. People likely bought anticipating the trade truce announcement.
And then cashed out when it actually happened.
That's likely a big part of the subsequent drop, yeah. Profit taking.
But here's a curious thing. While Bitcoin was dipping after that news, the regular stock markets like the Nasdaq and the S&P 500, they were actually up that day. Nasdaq up nearly 4%.
Right.
Why would they move in opposite directions on the same news?
That divergence is interesting. Arlie Barther from Nansen had a perspective on this in the source.
What was her take?
She suggested Bitcoin might have already rallied harder earlier because it was seen as being more insulated from tariff-related risks.
Ah, so it had already priced in some of that uncertainty.
Kind of. So when the risks seemed to decrease with the truce, other assets like altcoins, U.S. stocks, maybe even the dollar, things that were perhaps held back by the tariff fears, they had more room to catch up.
That makes sense. Bitcoin's insulation meant less upside from the truce itself compared to assets that were directly impacted.
Precisely. And then Kirill Kretov from CoinPanel, his view was also included. He called the 90-day tariff pause a clear, short-term positive signal for risk assets generally.
Including crypto.
Including crypto, yeah. Because pausing tariffs can ease inflation worries, improve global liquidity,
Yeah.
both generally good for assets like Bitcoin.
But he added a note of caution, didn't he?
He did. He stressed it's temporary, that 90-day clock is ticking, and he expects volatility will likely return as we get closer to that deadline.
So good for now, but don't get too comfortable. Keep an eye on the calendar.
Basically, yes. Suggests caution for investors thinking about the medium term.
Okay, so let's try and tie these threads together now. We have American Bitcoin making Bitcoin mining accessible via the stock market.
Yep, broadening access.
And at the same time, we see Bitcoin's price reacting quite sharply to global economic headlines, like trade news. How might these two things interact?
Well, there's definitely potential interplay. You could argue that having more ways to invest, like through a public mining stock, might, over the long run, bring in investors with a longer time horizon.
People less likely to panic sell on short-term news.
Perhaps. It could potentially lead to a more stable, diversified investor base over time, which might help moderate some of the extreme swings we see tied to macro events. A familiar stock format might attract different capital.
And what about the Eric Trump factor? Someone with that kind of political connection entering the public Bitcoin space. Does that signal anything bigger, like about mainstream acceptance or maybe even future regulation?
It's hard to say for sure, isn't it? It certainly raises Bitcoin's profile in those mainstream circles. Some might see it as a sign of growing legitimacy.
But could it also attract more scrutiny?
That's the other side of the coin. More visibility can definitely lead to more regulatory attention, which isn't necessarily bad. It could lead to clearer rules, but it's a complex dynamic. It adds another layer to watch.
So thinking about our listener, the learner, who's trying to sort all this out,
Yeah.
what are the main takeaways here? How does this help someone understand this evolving digital asset world?
I think for the learner, there are a few key things. First, how you can invest in Bitcoin is clearly changing, expanding. Companies like American Bitcoin going public offer new routes through familiar markets, like Nasdaq.
So more options beyond just buying the coin.
Exactly. Second, Bitcoin doesn't live in a bubble. Its price is very much plugged into a wider world, reacting to big economic news, especially trade developments right now.
You can't ignore the macro context.
Definitely not. And finally, this convergence, the growing ease of access, the involvement of prominent figures, it suggests Bitcoin and digital assets are becoming more integrated into the traditional financial system.
Even if that process involves bumps and volatility along the way.
Absolutely. It's an ongoing process and likely to remain volatile.
Okay, so let's recap then. Eric Trump's Bitcoin mining venture, American Bitcoin, going public via Gryphon, that's a major step, bringing Bitcoin's infrastructure onto the main stage of public market.
A new access point.
And this is happening while Bitcoin's price itself is proving sensitive to global economic currents, particularly trade dynamics.
That's the backdrop, yes. And this intersection really raises a crucial question, I think, for you, the listener.
What's that?
With more and more ways popping up to invest in Bitcoin or around it and seeing how much it reacts to global events, how should you navigate this? How do you approach what many are now calling an important asset class in this evolving landscape? What other questions does this raise for you about where Bitcoin is heading and how it fits into the bigger economic picture?